What makes Jack from Lord of the Flies the perfect villain? Well, there's a lot of things that make for a well-written villain or well-written antagonist in literature. A couple of those things are that they're supposed to apply pressure and conflict to the protagonist, but it's much more than that, and that's what we're going to talk about today. One of the most important aspects of an antagonist or a villain in a story is that their origin story should be tied to the protagonist. So in this case, Ralph. When we look at the first scene where Jack is introduced, the boys are voting on who should be leader and who should be chief. And what happens? They all vote for Ralph.
I guess she just won the election.
And the narrator gives us reasons for why that is. But as we can see in the book, it says this: Jack's face disappeared under a blush of mortification. So Jack is absolutely destroyed, or I should say his ego is absolutely destroyed when he loses the election. On top of that, just a page before, the narrator describes Jack in this way. Inside the floating cloak, he was tall, thin, and bony, and his hair was red beneath the cap. His face was crumpled and freckled and ugly without silliness. Out of his face stared two light blue eyes, frustrated now, and turning or ready to turn to anger. So this is another interesting or important aspect to Jack's character. The narrator says that he is ugly without silliness. So there's something unsettling or scary about his appearance. The fact that he's ugly without silliness, that's a very interesting way to put it, and it's important too, because although sometimes your antagonist or villain can be a handsome or beautiful person, in this case, he is not described that way. He's described as being ugly without silliness. Another instance where Jack is just showing his general character early on is when he tells Piggy, he says this: "You're talking too much. Shut up, fatty." That's the first time he's meeting this character, and to call him fatty and insult him like that, that's just, he's being mean right off the bat. So this isn't one of the deeper meanings behind why he's a great villain, but it's just, it's another aspect I think is worth noting. So the fact that Jack loses the election to Ralph, this is what spurs his entire arc. Everything he does from this point on is in response to that. He wants to prove himself as a hunter and as a leader of the hunters. He wants to prove himself as not just a leader of the hunters, but as the one who provides meat and sustenance to the other boys. Every chance he gets, he undermines Ralph's authority and basically tries to reassert himself as leader, and that's what eventually does happen. But so it all comes back to that first moment when he loses against Ralph. So really, being tied to the protagonist is the main reason why he makes for such a great villain or antagonist of this story. I don't want to spend too much longer talking about him. I think that you can go overboard with some of the analysis. And for Jack, it's really quite simple that, again, the reason why he's such a good villain or antagonist is because his origin story for why he does what he does is tied to Ralph's origin story. The moment Ralph becomes leader, Jack becomes the villain. And not just the villain, but a villain with vengeance. There's also another part later on I think is worth mentioning where Jack says this: "Bollocks to the rules. We're strong. We hunt." This piece of dialogue, as well as Jack's actions, show a complete rejection of civility. He is the one that's supposed to represent savagery, and by the end of the novel, we see that that really takes hold on the island. But here's the interesting thing. Although Simon and Piggy die, and there's chaos on the island, and they've totally devolved into this group of savages, the very last page puts Jack back in his place. When the naval officer asks, "Who's in charge here?" and Ralph says, "I am," and he says it loudly and proudly, we get a description of Jack that we haven't had yet, so I'll read that now. "A little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cap on his red hair, and who carried the remains of a pair of spectacles at his waist, started forward, then changed his mind and stood still." That's the final description of Jack that we get in the book. And so what the narrator has done has demoted him from chief to little boy. That's what's amazing about this book, is that on the final page, we get this sense of balance. It comes back to balance because When Ralph is leader, things are going well, even if everybody isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing, and things are a little out of order here and there, and they devolve. And Ralph has some failings as leader, which we talked about in the previous video. This part makes it right. This part reasserts Ralph as leader and puts Jack back down as a little boy. He's nothing more than a little boy. He never was the leader because he couldn't take responsibility for the horrible things that went down on this island. And so even though Jack isn't defeated in a physical sense, Ralph never overpowers him and he doesn't kill him, Jack is defeated in other ways. The fact that he's lost his position as leader just as they're being rescued shows that he's lost the battle. So even though Ralph is weeping over the darkness of man's heart, we do see that goodness prevails at the end, and there is a sense of balance and order at the very end of the book. If you like this video, be sure to check out the other ones I did. I have one about Piggy, one about Ralph, and a full book summary of Lord of the Flies. And if you have a question or comment, feel free to leave it below. And be sure to check out the next video where we do a deep dive on Infinite Jest. Thanks for watching.